right, good morning. Here we go, part 2. We probably could have done part 3 and 4 because the Bible has a lot to say, but we're going to finish it up today. All right, so what are we going to do today? First of all, we're going to talk about some leftovers from last week. I got some great questions from you guys, so I wanted to address a few of those things when we start off. Then we're going to look at Jesus' teaching on giving, which there's a lot of, although it's a little different than what we might be used to. And then we're going to look at examples of giving in the early church. That'll be interesting. And then we're going to talk about our attitude as we give. Attitude, you find out in life that attitude sometimes matters more than what you actually do, and that's certainly true in giving. And then this will be a wrinkle. We're going to talk about how the money was used in the New Testament times and how it's been used over the years, and that's been a moving target. And then we're going to talk about how are we doing here at Campusview in terms of our giving. And lastly, we're going to apply some of the things we learned over the 2 weeks. So let's jump in. Oh, by the way, we're still going to have our 3 special chalkboards, the whys of giving. These are the things we had on it last week. I won't read through those again. You heard them last week. But we're going to add to these chalkboards this week. So we'll get to those in a little bit. Leftovers. The first thing that I got asked by a few people, and I thought it was a great question, is you see the phrase in the Old Testament a lot of times, tithes and offerings. Why does it mention those separately? What's the difference between those two things? Well, it's a little hard to figure out. You have to read the book of Leviticus, and you'll probably have to take notes and draw circles and arrows. In some cases, there's overlap. But basically, the tithes were based on income or what they produced in their harvest, and that was the 10% they gave. The offerings were more often tied to an event. There was a particular offering for some purpose. Sometimes it was additive to the tithes. Sometimes it was a part of the tithes. You can sort that out if you study through the book of Leviticus and Numbers and Exodus and Deuteronomy. But that's kind of the differences. They overlapped some, but generally one was tied to giving based on what they made, and one was tied to specific events or purposes. Another question I got was, how did they think about taxes as it related to giving in the Bible? Well, again, part of your homework assignment was that first fruits thing. God said, I want your first fruits. The government comes second. I had one person, I got a kick out of this. I made a statement last week that nobody's happy when they pay their taxes. You don't feel joyful about paying your taxes. I had one person tell me that if they could take 10%, they would be happy with that. But they have to give them a lot more, so they're not so happy. But they did have taxes in biblical times. In fact, they probably had worse taxes than we do. There were periods of time, interestingly, when they really weren't subject to taxes, and then they decided they want a king, and so that was the end of that. But they either had taxes from the king when things were going well in the nation of Israel, or they were taxed by nations that took them over, and they had to pay taxes. So they had to deal with that just like we do. That wasn't new to them. And the last thing is interesting. Peter addressed this in his communion in passing. But this idea of redemption is interesting, and we didn't really talk about it a lot last week. You can study it out again in Leviticus. But the concept of redemption very often was related to the idea of something that was supposed to go to God, say some things you were required to redeem, like your firstborn son was dedicated to God, but God said, redeem your firstborn son. So there were specific offerings where you offered something and then your son came back to you. There were certain animals that if you wanted that animal to not be offered to God, you could pay a price and redeem it. The price was usually 120% of its value. So, you redeemed it, you paid a value, and then it wasn't offered. There were other sacrifices that you could not do that for. We're not going to get into all the details, but that idea of redemption is interesting to study because there's overlap to how it's talked about in the New Testament. Okay, let's get into what Jesus taught about giving. He had a lot to say. I will tell you that I didn't actually expect to do this part of it in our lesson today, but when I started reading it, I thought it was so good that we had to put it in. So he taught more about money than he did about giving per se. Jesus talked a lot about money and our heart about money and the way we thought about money. He did talk some about giving specifically, but not a lot. One of the things that I think is important to remember is that Jesus lived a normal Jewish life. So the Jewish sacrifices, the tithing, all the things that the Jews did as a part of their life, Jesus experienced that before, the whole time before he went into his ministry. So it wasn't foreign to him. He wasn't exempt from it. He did it just like everybody else. You can tell from the way people interacted with him that they just thought he was a regular guy like them. So they were surprised when they found out he was the Messiah. That was hard for some of them. But so he did all that stuff. He would have had to pay his taxes. These are a couple of interesting verses. Turn to Matthew chapter 17. We'll look at a couple of these examples. A lot of the verses I have in the presentation, but this one I don't. Matthew chapter 17, and we're going to pick up in verse 24. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax, which I don't know where that came from, but came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the tax?" "Yes, he does," he replied. Peter obviously we find out he had no idea what the answer was, but that never stopped him from answering. He said, "Yes, he does." When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. "What do you think, Simon?" He asked, from whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others? From others, Peter answered. "Then the children are exempt," Jesus said to him. "But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake, throw out your line, take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." So Jesus paid his taxes. He had a unique way of doing it. I'm not much of a fisherman, but if I could pay my taxes by fishing, I might become one. That's a great idea. And then in Mark chapter 12, this is a more familiar verse to us. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus is asked by the Pharisees, "Hey, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar?" And he gives such a great answer. In verse 16, it says, "Then they came to him and said, 'Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity. You can't be swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth.'" They're just buttering him up because they're trying to trap him. "Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we or shouldn't we?" But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. "Why are you trying to trap me?" he asked. "Bring me a denarius and look at it." They brought the coin, and he asked them, "Whose image is this and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then Jesus said to them, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." So Jesus paid his taxes. He lived a normal life. He went through all that stuff. Jesus spoke a lot about helping the needy. He talked about that frequently, and so it's fitting that Peter was here today and talked about that idea and hope. And, that's a great thing. We've been involved in that for a long time. Part of our contribution that we give each week goes towards hope. So some of you may say, "Well, I wish I had given to hope." Well, you have. You just didn't realize it, perhaps. But that's something that we give to, and many of us give to it in addition to the regular contribution. So Jesus talked about that, both with that and with benevolence, which is also a part of things. Look over in Luke chapter 22. This is an example of when Jesus highlighted giving more in the way that we think about it and practice it. Jesus talked about the needy, but I thought this was an interesting wrinkle in the way that he talked about this. In chapter 21 of Luke, in verse 1, as Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. "Truly, I tell you," he said, "this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in all she had to live on." So here he's talking about giving. I thought it was interesting that as much as Jesus spoke for the needy, he thought it was a good thing that she was doing what she was doing. Even though she was a needy person, she was still giving to God. And he held that example up and honored her for that. Another thing that is interesting about Jesus as far as giving is concerned is he was supported financially. If you look at these verses, Luke 8, 1 through 4, and Matthew 10, 9 and 10, in one verse it talks about how as he traveled and preached, there were women who were there with him who were supporting his ministry out of their own means. And so Jesus was financially supported as a preacher. He had worked his whole life as a carpenter, but once he started preaching, he was supported. And his apostles were supported as well. In Matthew 10, 9 through 10, which is referenced here, when he sends them out, he tells them, he says, look, don't take any money with you. Don't take any extra clothes. Don't take food for the journey, because a worker is worth his wages. Let the people support you while you're out doing the work that I'm calling you to do. So that was an expectation, and Jesus understood that and taught that to his apostles. And lastly, Jesus warned often against greed. A few weeks back, we looked at Matthew chapter 6, 19 through 34, where it talks about, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy. And that whole passage, he talked about that, so we've talked about that at length. Look over in Luke chapter 12. In Luke chapter 12, a guy comes up to him in verse 13, and in the middle of his sermon, hopefully that's not going to happen here today, but in the middle of his sermon, somebody says, teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. I don't know why he thought that was a good idea. Jesus didn't agree with him. He said, who appointed me a judge over you? And then he told them this parable in verse 16. The ground of a certain man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. This parable really hits home, I think, for us. We tend to store up. And he said, look, if you do that for yourself, if you store up for yourself and you're not rich toward God, Jesus says you're a fool. Not my words, the words of Jesus, but those are words that I need to pay attention to. So Jesus had lots to say about money and about giving, and we'll do well to remember that. All right, so let's talk about giving in the New Testament times and get some historical context, because I think we need that. One, turn to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, and we'll look at verse 5 through 11. The early church was a unique time of displacement. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there was no church, and the church started during Pentecost while people were in town for a festival. And so, who are we talking about? Let's pick up in verse 5. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. That's pretty far flung. From every nation under heaven. And so they hear the sound, they come to listen to, and they hear the sermon, and it's being given by Galileans. Look at verse 8. It says, then amazed they asked, aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongue. So the point is that these people were from all over the world, and they were in Jerusalem, and they didn't come there to move there. They came there for a festival. It was a short-term gig. You know, you pack differently if you're going on a trip for a week than you do if you're going on a trip for 6 months, right? Well, some of us do. Some people pack for 6 months, even if they go for a week. But if you don't believe it, just go on a cruise. You know, it's like, hey, it's only a 7-day cruise. Why do you have 14 suitcases? I don't know. But, you know, you pack differently if it's a short time. They had resources for a shorter trip, and then the church starts. Now what are they going to do? I mean, the church was completely new. It's not like they could say, well, we're just going to go back and hook up with the church in our hometown. There was no church in their hometown. This was it. And so it was a very unusual circumstances that they found themselves in. And so a lot of the early giving in the church was specifically because of this circumstance that was going on. I mean, they met in public places. They met in the temple courts. Everything was going great. People were being baptized like crazy, but they were from far away, and so they needed help. Then, a little later in the book of Acts, starting in chapter 8, persecution started. Now, the early persecution that the church experienced originated from the Jews. They got persecuted later by the Romans, but in Acts chapter 8, verse 1, flip over there. We're not going to read this at length, but you can see where it happens. This is right after the stoning of Stephen, and it says, on that day a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. And so the church that had been established, that had gathered together from all these places, it says they were scattered. They had to leave Jerusalem. And so they go to other places around there, but eventually they probably made their way back to those countries that we read earlier in the book of Acts. So there was persecution, and this affected them financially as well. Look at Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 32. The author says, remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you endured a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property, because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. So they were jailed, they were persecuted. In some cases, and this was primarily due to Roman persecution, but in some cases their property was taken away from them. They lost it. And so they were impoverished, not because of anything they had done, but because of the persecution they were enduring. And so again, that affected a lot of the giving of the church. You see more of the Roman persecution in the late Acts period, when Paul's put to death and other people are put to death. And then Revelation is basically about the conflict between the Roman Empire and the church. And so, all of this is going on in that period of time, but they went through a lot, and that affected the finances of the church. They didn't have buildings. When you're getting arrested and thrown in jail for being a Christian, getting together in a building like this is probably a bad idea. They just swoop in with a net and get all of us. That's not how they met back then, because it really wasn't practical for their circumstance. And even later, they met in they met in homes a lot, but they met in some really bizarre places. I mean, they met in the catacombs in Rome. I mean, can you imagine? Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of the catacombs in Rome, but there's skulls embedded in the walls. It's crazy. And, we're going to have church there. You thought the carpet in here was bad. I mean, there's no skulls on the wall. They met in some strange places. But that's what they had to do. Okay, and there were lots of widows and orphans due to the persecution. And so that was a big factor in how they dealt with things as far as giving. Okay, here are some verses we're gonna glance at. And we're not going to read these all completely, but we're going to look at some things about them. Acts 2, 42 through 47, 4 and 5, we'll look at those. Then we're going to look at Acts 6 and James 1. We're going to look at 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8 through 9. You actually referenced a verse, Peter, in your communion from there, and it was one that I didn't have on my list, so thank you. And then we're going to look at Romans chapter 12, verse 6 through 8. All right, so let's take a look at these. This one is familiar. We read this verse a lot. Usually we're talking about fellowship and being together and all that, but look at what's highlighted there in the middle. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. That's some pretty serious giving there. You might be thinking about your giving and saying, well, should I increase my giving? Nobody's coming around saying, you probably ought to sell that rental house you have and just give that money to the church. It's like, whoa, you're going over the line there. Nobody was telling them to do that, I don't think, but there were people who were doing that because there was such a need, a pressing need. So that was something that they did as a part of their community. This gets elaborated on a little bit more in Acts chapter 4. It tells the story of Barnabas and how they were all together. They didn't think about their possessions as their own. But look what's highlighted here. From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. So there was evidently some kind of a recognized process where this went on. They brought it to the apostles, gave it to them, and it got distributed from there. Again, it's an amazing thing that happens. It is, well, look at that. I left out one of the verses. We're going to have to read Acts chapter 5 on our own. I don't know what happened to that slide. We'll read it out of the Bible. I hope God wasn't taking it out so I wouldn't talk about it. Acts chapter 5, we're not going to read the whole, this is a crazy story. Acts chapter 5 is the story of Ananias and Sapphira. Now, it actually leverages off of the story we just looked at. Because Ananias and Sapphira, the gist of the story is that they acted like they were doing the same thing as Barnabas. All right, they sold some property and they came and brought it and laid some of the money down at the apostles' feet. Now, they only put a portion of it down. Now, that was okay. I mean, Peter, when he's explaining the thing, he says, look, after you sold the land, wasn't the money yours to do with whatever you wanted? You don't have to give it all to the church. But they come and act like they had sold their property and gave all the money to the church. And Ananias comes first, and he falls when Peter confronts him. Let's read. When Ananias heard this is after Peter told him that he had lied to human beings and to God. In verse 5, when Ananias heard this, he fell down and died. And great fear seized all who heard what had happened. If you're waiting for a point that applies to you about if you don't give contribution, you may die, that's not coming, just so you know. But obviously that would cause fear. Later, his wife comes in and go through the same thing, and she also falls down and dies. And so, that was a shocking thing that happened in the church, but it was based on this same idea. Chapter 6 of Acts. In those days when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them, that means the Greek Jews is what that means. The Greek Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So even in the early church, as they were collecting all this money and people were selling property and all that stuff, and the food was being passed out, you still got to be on your guard against people's prejudices. and the Grecian Jews or the Hellenistic Jews were getting overlooked. And so they came to the apostles and they said, this isn't right. Well, the apostles agreed with them. And they appoint 7 people, the first deacons. And they give them the responsibility of making sure that they get the food. Interestingly, all 7 of the guys that they appointed to take care of the Hellenistic Jews have Greek names. You can figure out what that means, I think. They wanted to make sure they had somebody that would take care of them properly. And so that's what happened in Acts chapter 6. James, in his book, describes how God looks at religion. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Again, this is what giving looked like in the first century church. Paul as the church went along, this extended even out into the Gentile world. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 1 through 4 about the collection they're taking up, which is helping to deal with these issues. But he tells them, on the first day of each week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income. You've heard these ideas. Why do we have contribution every week? I think it's largely because of this verse. I don't think that means that every person needs to give every week on Sunday. They didn't do that even in New Testament times. But there was a contribution taken up every week, and it was gathered and saved to meet these needs. And again, the idea that it's in keeping with your income, that's part of it. I want to probably the text in the New Testament that we're most familiar with, as far as giving is concerned, because it has the most to say about it, is 2 Corinthians chapter 8 through 9. Now, we're not going to read 2 chapters, so don't moan. We're just going to look at some excerpts. But this is inspiring. I will tell you, when I was prepared, I was sitting in the living room. Betsy and I were sitting there, and I was going through this, and I was writing these verses down, and I got so fired up. By the time I got done with this chapter, I told Betsy, we need to increase our contribution. That's a true story. And so we did. But, because it's inspiring stuff, so prepare to be inspired. Paul says in chapter 8, verse 7, but since you excel in everything, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. What are you good at? I mean, what are you good at in your life? Corey, what are you good at? Putting you on the spot. It doesn't have to be spiritual. Sports. All right, Corey's good at sports. I'm not going to pick on anybody else. That didn't go well. Maybe you're good at music. Maybe you're good at writing. Maybe you're good at planning parties. I don't know what you're good at. We're all good at one thing or another. Do you ever feel like, man, I really want to be good at giving money? That's a rare thing to hear somebody say. But, Paul tells them, hey, you're good at lots of other stuff. Make sure you're good at giving, too. I think a lot of us actually do feel that way, and I think that's commendable. Another excerpt. This is really an important verse. Paul says, for if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. Look, remember the widow and her offering. What did Jesus say? She said she put in more than everybody else. Now, anybody who was an accountant will hear what Jesus said and said, oh no, she only put in 2 small copper coins. That other guy over there put in a whole bag of silver. I mean, he put in hundreds of times more. Jesus said, nope. No, she put in more than him. Well, how does that math work, Jesus? Because God looks at it according to what you have, not what you don't have. it's interesting when you talk about giving and you interact with people about giving. One of the things that you're always going to hear, we already talked about one. Well, do I have to figure it out before tax or after? That's one thing you hear. But another thing you hear is, well, I don't have very much. Well, that's okay. That doesn't matter. It's what you have, not what you don't have. And here's another thing. If you don't have a lot and you're giving, what you've decided in your heart to give that's appropriate for what you have, feel great about it. Don't feel like, well, I don't give very much, I'm no good. That's not how God views it. That's not how Jesus viewed the widow. He said, that woman's exceptional, even though she gave the smallest amount of anybody. So that's the way God looks at it. Here's another one. Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will reap generously. That's in chapter 9, verse 6. I told you last week, I've always been somebody who said, well, I don't buy into that prosperity gospel stuff. I don't like it when that's preached. And there's parts of that are true. But you can't escape the idea that God says over and over again, he looks at generosity and blesses it. The Bible says that frequently. So there it is again. Let's look at some more. There's a lot of good ones in here. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. You should feel great about what you give. Be happy to give it. That should, turning loose of the money. Normally when we turn loose of money, we don't feel happy about it. But God says, no, when you're giving, you ought to be cheerful about it. And again, it's what you've decided in your heart to give. Another thing that you always hear when you talk about this topic and you interact with people is, well, does 10% still apply now? I'll give you a short answer to a long question. And the answer is the New Testament never says you have to give 10%. I mean, it's the same God that was in the Old Testament. You got to figure that out in your own heart and that's what it says. It says what you've decided in your heart to give. You have to work that out between you and God and do your best to figure out what God wants you to give. Next thing, I love this. And God is able to bless you abundantly so that in all things, at all times, having all you need, you will abound in every good work. That's pretty inclusive, isn't it? I mean, we're starting to see now in the church in Corinth where things are expanding, and it's a little bit more than just taking care of the immediate distress that was there at the beginning. There were more things than just those things. I mean, it was all things, all times, all that you need in every good work. I love this verse, this excerpt here. This is chapter 9, verse 10. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. Again, the idea that God is going to see what we do, and he's where the source is really of what we have, and he's going to give us what we need and increase. He says, I'm going to increase your store of seed because you gave some of yours. That's what he says here. He says, you will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion, and through us your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. I promise you there's nothing they're selling at Belk's or Walmart or wherever you shop that is going to enrich you in every way on every occasion and result in thanksgiving to God. You might get somebody say, that's a nice looking shirt you got there. That's about all you're going to get. And you might get a few years of wear out of it. But it's not going to do this. I loved what you showed in your slide in the communion, how this is what hope is doing, but this is what God does all the time, and it's what God's doing through hope. He takes the little bit that we do, and he makes something great out of it that's far beyond what we could ever do on our own energy. That's just how God works across many, many different things. And lastly, thanks be to God for your indescribable gifts. I'm going to say this again later, but I want to take a moment again to say thank you to the people in the church who give so consistently and regularly and faithfully. God appreciates it, but it helps the church in so many great ways. And, Paul is overwhelmed at the end of this section. He just says, I can't even describe it. Thanks be to God for the gift that you give. Okay. Turn over to Romans chapter 12. We're going to have a little fun with this one. We alluded to it earlier, but Romans chapter 12. And in the middle of Romans chapter 12, he starts talking about spiritual gifts. And he talks about all these different gifts that people have. And this is in the first few verses. And in the midst of the gifts that he's talking about, that he talks about it starting in verse 3. It goes down through verse 8. But in the middle of that, he says, we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. And one of them that he mentions in verse 8 is, if it is giving, let them give generously. Again, that idea of the gift of giving. I think we all want to have spiritual gifts in our life. We read in last time we read in Deuteronomy chapter 8 about how it's the Lord that enables us to get wealth. Well, I think a lot of us want that gift. Lord, give me the gift of creating wealth. I want that. But there's also a gift of giving that is perhaps less desired. Here's a question for you. How do I know if I have the gift of giving? How do I know if I have the gift of giving? Is it a feeling? Does somebody tell me, I think you have a gift of... No, how do I know if I have the gift of giving? Well, I decided I would make it simple for us, theologically speaking, to tell whether we had the gift of giving or not. If you've got the goods, you've got the gift. God didn't give you that stuff just to sit around. He wants you to do something with it. So that's just that simple. If God has blessed you and you've got a lot, God has given you the gift of giving. How well are we using that? Okay, let's talk about some attitudes of giving. Giving was done in loving support of the needs of the community, whatever they were. That's the way giving happened. It wasn't coerced. It wasn't something that they had to, they talked about so much. There was a need and they met it. They wanted to support the needs of the community. It was incredibly generous. I was reading this stuff in the Bible as I was preparing for the lesson, and I was just overwhelmed by the way they thought and the way they gave. They were amazingly generous. They were happy about it. They were excited about it in most cases. Some people, Ananias and Sapphira were evidently not quite so happy about it. But, they were cheerful about it. They were glad to give it to meet the needs. That's the way they did things. And it was unworldly. What do I mean by that? They weren't attached to the world. That's why they were able to give it. That question that we asked about, does it have to be 10%? How much am I supposed to give? Here's what I will tell you about that. Once we get to a point where we have turned loose of our love of money and we're not attached to it, we're not worldly in our thinking, then it's a simple thing to figure out. I'm not saying the number's simple, but you talk about it, you pray about it, maybe you get some advice about it. But it's not that complicated. The problem is that sometimes our fist is closed tight. That's what makes it complicated. It's not that complicated once we're disconnected from the world. What was the money used for in the early church? We're going to run through a few of these. Feeding and caring for the church members. Now, that's something that, I more or less expect you guys to figure out dinner on your own. You might have you over to the house and feed you dinner, but we don't sit around and say, okay, we've got to make sure that 60% of the church is getting meals because otherwise they're going to go hungry. That's not our reality. But in the early church, that was the reality, and so feeding and caring for the members was a big part of things. Taking care of widows and orphans was a big part of things in the early church because, again, there was a lot of distress, and that was a big issue. Benevolence needs caused by persecution were a big part of what they addressed with the giving. And this one may surprise you. Support for the apostles, the evangelists, and the elders were part of what they spent money on. They spent money on the, I guess for lack of a better term, church staff. And then they did all things, all times, every good work. And, the guys that were, we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, how is the money used? Let's dig in a little bit to this supporting people thing. The apostles and their families were supported. In 1 Corinthians 9, let's turn over there. 1 Corinthians 9. You have to pay attention to details to get what's going on here. Verse 3, Paul's talking to the church in Corinth that he had planted and that was very familiar with him. He says, "This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right not to work for a living?" So these guys, they got their full-time support from the church and their families as well. And, that was a good thing. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Before you feel too sorry for Paul, I think that we are very familiar with the idea that Paul was a tent maker and sometimes supported himself, but that might not have been as common as we think. He did do that, but in verse 7 of 1 Corinthians 11, he says, let's pick up in verse 5. He says, "I do not think that I'm in the least inferior to those super apostles. I may indeed be untrained as a speaker, but I do have knowledge. We have made this perfectly clear to you in every way. Was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so as to serve you." So Paul it's kind of interesting. Paul would preach in one place while he was supported by another place, and then he would go to another place, and that other place would support him there. So, he wasn't always drawing money directly from the people he was working with, but he got supported. So apostles were supported. Evangelists were also supported. There are examples. This goes back to in 2 Corinthians 9, verse 6, he talks about other people who were with him, Barnabas and Timothy and others, that were also supported. In 3 John, in verse 6, it said, John tells the church there, hey, these guys are sacrificing to teach you and preach to you, so make sure you treat them in a way that honors God and takes care of them. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. It talks about if somebody's caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourself, you may also be tempted. Then it says, carry each other's burdens. In this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Down in verse 6 it says, nevertheless, the one who receives instruction in the word should share all good things with their instructor. It was the biblical pattern to support these people. Elders, 1 Timothy. We're going to look at a few more passages, and then we're going to get to us a little bit. 1 Timothy chapter 5. And we'll pick up in verse 17. It says, "The elders who direct the affairs of the church are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching." Now, you might say, well, there's no money involved there. Well, when you talk about honor, biblically, you're talking usually about money. Although I think he's kind of playing a word game here where he's saying elders ought to be respected and they also ought to be paid. Although, some people say an elder who teaches is worthy of a double salary. Alan told me when I became an elder that my salary as a teacher got doubled. I was excited about that. My salary as a teacher was $0, so it didn't really change my life. I'm not asking for money. God's taking care of me. I don't need that. But I did get it doubled, just so you know, so you can feel good about that. But the idea of elders being paid is something that may not be familiar to us, but it was very familiar to the church in the New Testament, and I think sometimes it's appropriate even in our time. So that was something they did. There's a couple of other categories that are less certain. Teachers are often grouped with the apostles and the elders, and so they may have been in that same category. And deacons, it doesn't talk about deacons being paid, but I think there's a lot of discussion when they talk about deacon about how they needed to not love money, and they needed to not love unlawful gains. I think the reason for that is because they handled a lot of money for benevolent stuff, and they may have been paid, but I don't know if that's the case or not. None of the people who were supported by the church lived lavishly. In fact, I read an interesting comment when I was studying about this, and it said that supporting the staff of the church was really just kind of an extension of taking care of the poor, because that's kind of how they lived. And so it's not like I don't want you to think they were getting rich. In our context, in modern times, a lot of times preachers live lavishly. God's not pleased with that. That's not his intention. It doesn't happen around here, but it happens in some places and it's not right. But they were supported. Okay. Question: how are we doing in giving at Campusview? Well, in the first place, again, I want to say many of us are very consistent and generous. Thank you. It's amazing what the church has done over the years. I look out and see faces. Some of you have been here and giving money for almost your whole life. I mean, you started in high school or college, and you've been giving to the church, and now to be blunt, you're pretty old now, and so you've been doing it a long time. I wasn't talking about you specifically, Tom, but I mean, since you're laughing, so obviously you're one of those guys. Okay, so we've been doing it for a long time. That's great. Thank you. Second, we're not currently meeting our budget. Now, the budget is done with a lot of prayer and thought. It's not done casually. It's done based on what we've given in the past. And right now, we're coming in a little under our budget. There's a lot of reasons why that might happen. I'm not up here saying, hey, we're doing badly because we're not meeting our budget. I don't know all the situations, but we're not meeting our budget. We'll adjust if we need to, but that's something that we're not doing right now. Here's what I do want to talk about a little bit. We currently have around 215 members. We're trying to figure out exactly how many we have. That's harder than you may think, especially after COVID and remote meetings and all that kind of stuff. But we think that we have around 215 members in the church. On average, we have about 60 giving units. Now, giving units, what does that mean? Well, Betsy and I are a giving unit because we give together. So that's 2 people, 1 giving unit. A lot of us are not we're not in a group like that. And so individuals would, if you're an individual, you would be a giving unit. So we currently have about 60 giving units a week on average. And some of the giving units we have are not even members of the church. Again, like I said last week, I don't know who gives what. Don't particularly want to know. So I don't know who falls into this category. But those are the numbers. There's also some cash that's given, and so that shows up, and some of the cash that's given, people put it in an envelope so we can keep track of it for tax purposes. Other people just put cash in the bag. But there's the amount of cash that's given is quite small. It's not a lot of money. Not that the amount matters, but what I'm saying is the cash that's given is not. It's not an amount that says, okay, everybody else is just giving cash. It's a very small amount. So what that means is you can't look at the data without coming to the conclusion that we have a significant number of people that are members of the church that don't give at all. Yep. That's what it is. And our talent participation is running behind last year in pledges. So why am I telling you all this? Am I telling you this because we need more money in the church? No, that's not the point. The point is that if you're a disciple and you're a member of the church and you're not giving, you're missing out. I mean, all that stuff we read about the verses about God, about honoring God, knowing where He comes from, that God blesses us when we give, all of that stuff. We're missing out on that if we're not giving. Now, let me say a word here. If you're here visiting, I'm not talking to you, I'm sorry. This isn't a normal sermon. We very rarely talk about money here. So if you thought, wow, it's my first time here and they're already shaking me down for money. No. That's not what we're trying to do. And so we're glad to have you as our guest. We're not asking for that. What I'm saying is if you're a part of the church and you're not giving, you're missing out on a lot of the blessings in life that God wants you to have. And it's not just that you're going to get, you're giving more to get more. That's not what I'm saying. There is a blessing that comes from giving that's not monetary. It's important for us to give to God for our own hearts. God doesn't need our money. He made all the stuff, okay? I mean, do you really think you have anything at your house that you own that impresses God? Probably not. I mean, I've got some cool guitars, but I don't think that God's really wowed by my guitars. It's just not, that's not the way it works. It's good for my heart. People give at different intervals and different times. That's fine. Some people give quarterly, some people give annually, some people give monthly. Because that's how your money works. So if you get paid once a month and you give once a month, I'm not telling you that's a bad thing. If you give once a year, another question that comes up, well, I'm retired now. I used to have a big job and make lots of money, and now I'm retired. What do I do now? Well, I would expect you to probably give less if you're retired and you're not making much money. But giving is still an important part of things. Again, once you're not plugged into the money and it doesn't have a hold of your heart, pray about it, think about it, decide in your heart, get advice if you need to, and feel great about it. That's okay. And I recognize that the economy's tough. Okay, there are things going on there. Again, giving is dynamic. It changes. And that's all right. Applying what we've learned. Take some time to reflect on God's blessings in your life and figure that out. Giving is an honor. Figure out how you want to participate in that. Again, I'm not going to tell you this is the amount, this is the percentage. That's not my job. Take the time to consider and think about money and how we use it. how do I feel about money? How do I think about money? How attached am I to it? Jesus had a lot to say about money. Go back and look at the things that he had to say about it and think about that in your own heart. Giving is to God. I mean, we give to the church, but recognize that we're giving to God. And like the parable we looked at that Jesus told about the farmer who tore down his barns, make sure that we're rich towards God. We don't want to be rich towards ourselves and not towards God. Giving is a spiritual issue, not a financial issue. We're not talking about this because we think money's important and the church needs more money. We're talking about this because it's a spiritual issue. And one thing I've learned from reading the Bible that Jesus felt is that if money has my heart, God can't have it. And so it's a spiritual issue and something we certainly need to think about. If we're not giving at all, I think we need to consider carefully the things that we've talked about in these lessons. We're missing out if we're not giving. And lastly, we don't give to get, but God does bless those who give the right way with the right heart. The scriptures say that over and over again, and I think that's important. And I said previously, finances are dynamic, giving should be as well. What I mean by that is if your finances change in a negative way, and you're giving based on what you have, don't feel guilty if you're giving a little bit less. Hey, there's a first, right? I'm doing a sermon on giving, and I tell you, if you give a little bit less, don't feel bad about it. That's not how that usually goes. But if your situation has changed, that's okay. But by the same token, if your situation changes a lot in a positive way, that should be reflected in your giving as well. Sometimes we get locked in on a certain number, and we've been given that number for years, and we don't take time to think and reconsider as our situation changes. So I think that's important to do. Let's look at our chalkboards one last time. The things we're going to add, the whys of giving. Love for God, love for each other, and love for the world around us. God has given us the gift of giving. We're very rich as a country, as a people, and that should be reflected in what we do. The hows of giving. We should give generously, cheerfully, and from the heart, not under compulsion. How we think about giving, not just as a part of church life, but rather as a privilege, a way to imitate God. God is the ultimate giver. He gives to all of us every day. And one last verse as we close. In Acts chapter 20, remembering the words of the Lord Jesus himself, that he said, it's more blessed to give than receive. Those are good words to live by. I hope the things we've looked at about giving have been helpful to you over the last couple of weeks. If you have questions, if you want to bounce things off me, I'm around. Others will be helpful to you as well. But thank you for considering this, and hope it'll help you to be where you need to be in this important topic. We love you.